And Chris Forehand and Associates from Panhandle Engineering are going to be providing a workshop on the City of Lynn Haven's Stormwater Master Plan. And Chris, I'm sure you're already planning to do this, but if you don't mind, before you start, could you just give a brief history of how we got to the point of having a plan for those who may not be aware?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Commissioners. I'm Chris Forehand.
We're not hearing you.
I'm Chris Forehand with Panhandle Engineering. I've also got Doug Crook here with me. He's one of our senior stormwater engineers. Just to give you a little history, back in the probably the summer of 2017, we started talking about doing a stormwater master plan of the city, and so we put together a scope to do that, and then you all put it in your budget for us to accomplish it. And we started back in the fall of 2017. As you know, we experienced a little bit of a delay with Hurricane Michael, probably about 6 months for us. And we had a lot of other activities we were working on for the city related to the damages. So now we're ready, finally ready to submit and present to you our findings of that stormwater master plan. I'm going to turn it over to Doug and let him talk about the study and how we got to where we are with these recommendations, and then I'll follow up at the very end with some of the funding options and how to pay for it.
Oh, hello everyone. For those that don't know me, my name is Doug Crook. I'm a senior civil engineer with about 19 years of experience. Most of that falls within the Central Florida area, where stormwater requirements are very strict compared to this area.
Could you get closer to the microphone because the people behind you can't hear you? I apologize, but everybody has to be close to the microphone for it to work.
Is that better?
That's perfect.
Okay. Alright, so we started a little over a year ago, and today is the fruition of that study. So what I'm going to talk about first is the methodology for which we put together this study. The first phase was data gathering. As you can imagine, to do a study across an entire city, that requires quite a bit of data. So we met with city staff to determine what areas of concern were already known so that we could focus on those areas and learn what information was readily available, and then figure out what we didn't know so that we could obtain that information via several ways. One was field survey, which we had field crews go out and give us survey information for quite a bit of your major drainage paths. You're going to hear that term quite a bit throughout this presentation. We also did site investigations because we couldn't survey the entire city. There were several areas of known issues where we needed to just put boots on the ground and put eyeballs in the area. It didn't necessarily require survey. Water flows downhill. Some of it is really that simple. So in those areas, we curtailed the survey effort and focused that just on the primary drainage paths, and then we physically went out into the field to study some of the other areas. We also looked at numerous online resources for information that was available, soils and what have you. And then we also did some research into existing studies, particularly drainage studies and documentation related to drainage throughout the city. And we actually were able to get 3 different drainage studies from DOT, both on the 390 widening, on 17th Street and 11th Street. So those studies combined provided us with quite a bit of information. And then from that, we went into the second phase, which was creating the stormwater model. That included our software that we have, and it's a tool that you can utilize both for a 1 acre site, but it also applies to studies across an entire city in larger areas. And once we had a model of the existing conditions of the city, we then took that model and modified it in areas where the model showed us where there were flooding issues, drainage issues, capacity issues. Some of these we knew, some of them we could tell from the survey before we modeled anything. We knew there was going to be a problem here. And then meeting with city staff and getting information from background and years in history, we knew that there were other areas as well. So we then took that model of your existing conditions and made improvements to key areas to see how those specific infrastructure improvements used flood staging. Anyway, there were numerous areas around the city where the model did identify both known and unknown infrastructure bits and pieces where improvements would have significant benefit. And then from there, we developed recommendations. Several of those, as I mentioned, were model-driven. You could tell by running different scenarios in the model that making this change had this benefit, that change had less benefit or more benefit, and so on and so forth. It was a very iterative process, looking at multiple areas all around the city. So the model was able to inform us of numerous specific infrastructure improvements. And also, there were areas, and I'll get into it more in the presentation, but there are other areas that didn't necessarily require modeling. As I mentioned, you could just go out there in the field and look at it. You could see ditches were clogged or undersized, or there was no area for water to go, so it just staged up and pooled in areas. So here are some of the other discussion topics. Looks like this slide got rearranged here. So the methodology I just talked about. I'm going to touch on Hurricane Michael considerations. I mean, this is a drainage study. We've all seen what can happen in a severe storm event, so that's fresh in our minds. I'm going to talk about the study results and thereby our recommendations that came out of that. And then I'm going to talk about some priorities for implementation, both infrastructure recommendations and some policy recommendations. And then I'll turn it over to Chris, who's going to talk about some of the funding sources to help the city implement these. Okay, some of these you already know. This is existing conditions and contributing factors. These are the things that are causing the drainage issues around the city. Okay, we all know it's pretty flat in the area. Topography is relatively flat across the city. And you also have some depressional areas. These are low-lying areas with higher ground that surrounds them. So for water to leave depressional areas, the only way it can do that is to stage up for the water level to rise and then flow over the lowest point in which it can. There are numerous areas like that around the city of varying degree of concern. We've also got a high groundwater table. I mean, we're close to a large body of water. That inherently means you have a high groundwater table. When you have low topography next to large water bodies, you're going to have high you don't have to dig very far to get to groundwater, in other words. This was complicated after Hurricane Michael because we lost a large percentage of trees. Depending on the tree species and age, they will soak out of the ground 50 to 250 plus gallons per day. So if you can wrap your head around how many trees we lost, that's how much groundwater is now staying in the ground. And there were drainage issues before the storm, so painting a picture. We've also got poor soil conditions. There's a varying degree of soil types in the area, but predominantly they are moderate to low drained soils. And even when they're moderately drained, you've got the shallow groundwater condition. So that means even in areas that have very little hard surface and pavement, concrete, even those areas, you expect them to shed off water. Most of the water, in fact, that falls on it. Well, that happens when you have high groundwater and poor soil conditions combined. So you have a lot of runoff from unimproved surfaces throughout the city as well. Aged and unmaintained infrastructure. So throughout the city, most of the drainage systems are interconnected via old drainage pipes, canals, culvert pipes of varying sizes and ages and conditions. The level of maintenance and damage over the years has eroded the capacity of these systems to drain and to store water. There's also a lack of stormwater management facilities, and what I mean by that is more like a regional stormwater facility. I know you have one, but that's not a hit on the city, because regional stormwater facilities are things that you build in a master plan. A master plan community, a plan development will have a stormwater master plan with stormwater infrastructure built in anticipation of the full build-out of that development. Well, we don't have that opportunity in the city, and it's extremely difficult to install a regional stormwater system in a built environment. There's also inadequate conveyance system capacities. You've got ditches and culverts all throughout the city that are undersized for what they're being expected to, for the demand placed on them. And I mentioned earlier, you've got depressional areas that have a lack of positive outfalls. So the only way for those to drain is for the water level to stage up until it can physically drain. So regardless of how big your pipes are, if there's no connection to that area, to the ultimate receiving water, which for all of Lynn Haven is North Bay, then the water is going to stage up before it can get out. There's also a lack of stormwater specific funding. There are other municipalities that throw something at that for regular maintenance, and you're going to hear that again because it's rolled in our recommendations. And relaxed permitting regulations. In 2007, stormwater management permitting criteria regulations, those were transferred from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection to the Northwest Florida Water Management District. And at that time, the region kind of caught up with the rest of Florida as far as the regulations that were placed on the design of stormwater management systems. So that didn't occur until 2007. So anything that was built before that was built to a lesser standard. So I'm going to show you a couple of maps. This first one is reported flooding across the city from the July 4th, 2013 storm event. There are red and blue dots all around the city. They're colorized lots, both residential and commercial, where the owners reported structural flooding on that property. Now, structural flooding is different from standing water in your yard. This is water inside your building. So your yard's already flooded, or a portion of it's already flooded, and it's also inside your structure. I make note of that because I've heard numerous concerns about ponding here and ponding there, but structural flooding is a whole nother level of concern. And these maps were very helpful for us to determine where the problem areas were. Just by looking at these maps, you can tell these areas have a problem of some kind. And the study did help inform us on what could be done about them. This next map is the May 2nd, 2014 flood event. Now this one was not as widespread as far as structural flooding reported across the city. It's in a smaller area, but you may notice that the properties that reported structural flooding are more grouped into clusters. This leads me to believe, I wasn't here for the storm, but just looking at the two maps in comparison, this was an intense storm event that was not necessarily intense all across the city, but in this particular area where you're seeing these clusters of flooded properties, the intensity was very high in these areas. Okay, this is just a quick graphic showing across the city how we modeled your major drainage channels and outfall paths. These three major basins, we call them northwest and east, they encompass the majority of your major drainage channels. They also encompass the majority of the properties that reported structural flooding in those two storm events. So our models covered all of this area, a majority of the city, and allowed us to model the means by which these areas drain to North Bay. Now, you'll note that there are some areas of the city that were not included in the computer model. These areas, in the northwest quadrant, for example, these drain primarily via roadside drainage system. It's culverts, it's ditches. They drain in a connected series, semi-connected in some instances, but they ultimately drain to North Bay. But they do that via the roadside system, not a large ditch or canal that traverses through a large portion of the city. If you've been to major cities, you've probably seen some of the large concrete drainage channels. That's exactly what they do. They're typically pretty flat, which means they have to be as big as they are to get that much water out to wherever they want it to go. Well, for these areas that were outside the model, they're relatively close to the ultimate receiving water, and they're roadside drainage systems are adequate to a degree of allowing water to drain from those areas to the bay. And therefore, we did not need to model that. Okay, here's another graphic. This was an early one that we used to help identify the major basins. But of the 3 major basins, there are numerous sub-basins. We modeled up to around 40 different little basins, because we have to take this in bite-sized chunks. We can't say this 1,200-acre basin flows down this one drainage channel, because it doesn't. The drainage channel is miles long, and along that path, water enters it along its entire length. So we have to break it up into bite-sized chunks, aggregate, estimate the information for those individual basins, and make a determination as to where that water gets into the major drainage channel. And that was how we built the model. So the level of detail is something I wanted to touch on real quick. This approach was, as I mentioned, we took the large basins into smaller bite-sized chunks in order to estimate as accurately as we could how and where that water gets into your major drainage paths. So the dots are the different basins, they're individual basin data, and the red dots are where they actually enter the drainage path. And I know it's kind of hard to see on the screen there, but it also shows some of the locations of the major drainage paths. The lack of maintenance not reflected in the models. So to put information in the model, we're looking at sizes of pipes. We're looking at the elevations at the upstream and downstream ends. We're looking at ditches. We survey them so that we know their sizes and their depths. The things that we couldn't account for is from A to B in a pipe, how much silt is in the bottom of it. Well, our model reflects none, but that's surely not the case, probably not the case in any pipe that we model. So the existing conditions model is somewhat optimistic. It assumes everything is clean and brand new, with the exception of open ditches, where we are able to, in the model, put in a factor for vegetation growth. And we did that. We took photographs, collected them, and then along the drainage paths, we incorporated the actual vegetation growth, so at least that could be reflected in the model. We also surveyed areas of the drainage paths where we thought there were pinch points. And there's miles of these. We weren't able to, in the time frame, survey every foot of these paths. So we went and did cross sections every so many feet, and we added into that cross sections wherever there were widened sections relatively, or narrowed sections which were of more concern, so that we could model pinch points. Those pinch points are important because those are the kinds of things we're looking to eliminate. Water flows best out of a smooth cross section. Anytime you interrupt that, you're restricting the flow. Again, the analysis was based on pre-hurricane conditions, and I'm going to talk about post-hurricane conditions a little further in the presentation. But we focused primarily on these clustered areas of known drainage issues. This study is to alleviate known structural problems and also inform you as to where there are other improvements that could be made. So we focused the study on particular areas where there were clusters of reported structural flooding, and areas in the model, not necessarily where there was reported flooding, but where it was very obvious that improvements to the infrastructure could make the conditions better, both upstream and downstream. Okay, so Hurricane Michael considerations. As you can imagine, a lot of debris was blown everywhere. And then a lot of rain washed down all of your drainage systems and into your pipes and inlets and your channels. Not all of that is clearly visible by walking the streets, looking into inlet tops, looking into ditches. All right, ditches maybe so, but your pipe systems are of significant concern. Even on the drive here down 77, there are ditches separated by a driveway. They're all up and down 77, and they're throughout the city, I would imagine, as well, where one ditch is slammed full of water. There's lily pads and wetland species growing in it, and the one next to it's dry. Well, there's something in the pipe next to it. That driveway is, there's clearly a blockage there. Those blockages existed well before the storm. They were made much worse by the storm. Some debris, obviously tree debris, but the picture on the right has construction, demolition type debris from someone moving damaged material out of their homes. Some of that material breaks down and expands. You've got sheetrock there, you've got pressed particle board, furniture. I know you've seen that stuff get wet, it swells. So that kind of stuff is blocking your drainage systems everywhere, mostly where you can't see it. Okay, so a summary of results. We identified specific areas of recommended improvements in the model, but we also, and I'll touch on some of those here later on, the highest priority items in our opinion. But it also identified a need for a comprehensive citywide operational maintenance plan. This would include regular maintenance. Well, first, identification of priorities. Right, you want to focus on priorities first, and then a trickle-down effect after that. Those are the kinds of existing infrastructure facilities that need to be identified, and then routine maintenance needs to be developed, a scheduled plan, if you will, and then implemented. And then there are other general recommendations for future development. I'll touch upon that in our policy recommendations. First, the infrastructure. Again, Hurricane Michael waterway debris removal is of utmost importance, both in the channels, the open channels that you can see, and in your drainage piping systems where you can't readily see what's in there. Primary drainage route improvements. These were things identified in the model. There were several of your primary drainage channels which neck down and narrow in certain locations, thereby causing the water to stage like a dam. It stages the water upstream of that point. So those need to be opened up with the intent of making a continuous, as continuous of a consistent cross-section as possible all the way out to North Bay. And that needs to be done in a selective manner. You need to work downstream and go upstream, because if you do it the other way around, you're just going to push that flooding onto somebody else.
May I ask, the studies that you guys did and the recommendations that you guys made, I know we haven't got to that part yet, but did you guys take into account also the construction that's going to be taking place on 390 and some of these improvements that's factored into our analysis?
Yes, and I'm going to touch on some of those in a few slides. Next was improved drainage in areas of historic structural flooding. Again, those were some of the areas that we focused on in the model, and we do have numerous specific recommendations for them. In fact, that's the list on the right. There's 25 items that we identified solutions for them and put together some rough costs, order of magnitude costs that are included in your report. I mentioned before, develop a stormwater operation and maintenance program. I feel like that's important. It is somewhat of a policy recommendation, but it is specifically for infrastructure. And then develop a citywide ditch and culvert rehabilitation program. You've got areas across the city that are relying strictly on roadside drainage. And you can drive down any one of them, and you won't have to go very far. You're going to see a driveway where there's an old corrugated metal pipe. It's crushed on one or both ends, or it's 12-inch, and there's 15 acres that have to drain through it. There's numerous locations where that exists. So, although it's not a specific location type improvement or recommendation, it's really a citywide program that we're recommending Again, if there's priorities that can be identified, perhaps reaching out to the populace would help you identify those and set priorities. But anyway, that's one of our key recommendations. Next is policy recommendations. We felt this was important to include in the study. It's outside a drainage study scope, but these are certainly things that would help improve drainage conditions throughout the city in the future. First is a look at the land development code, and we recommend revisions that would prohibit impacts to storage and drainage capacity of your existing infrastructure. The last thing, you've already got problems or issues citywide that need improvements. The last thing you want to do is approve new construction that limits the current capacities. For example, a new driveway where a 12-inch pipe or a 15-inch pipe is put in just like all the other neighbors on the street, whether they're residential or commercial, it doesn't matter. Somebody needs to look at how much water goes through that, because 12-inch, 15-inch, there's a good chance it's probably not big enough. LDC revision to require compensation for floodplain encroachment. In the Central Florida area, they require a cup for cup is the term that's used. If you fill 1 cup worth of floodplain, you need to provide 1 cup of floodplain. They don't prohibit floodplain impacts. They just ask that you put back whatever you took. It's not a requirement today, but I feel that's very important. A lot of the areas where you do have problems are adjacent to or within floodplains. As you're well aware, I'm sure, the Fema firm map, floodplain map, is about to go through a revision. I think 2020 is the date for finalization of that, and a lot of the floodplains that are adjacent to the Bay system are going to be expanded. So that would be a particular concern. Purchase property or obtain easements for all existing drainage ways serving the general public. There is one area in particular, and I know there's more than one, where you've got a primary drainage channel running through private property. There are numerous fences that run directly across this drainage path, both chain link fences and wood privacy fences. Not a whole lot of water is going through there. Even if it was a chain link fence, that chain link is going to collect every bit of debris that attempts to flow past it. That debris will turn into a beaver dam in one storm. It doesn't take very much. We just had one good storm.
That rewinding the tape a few minutes, that 1 cup in, 1 cup out, that law that they passed there, how do they measure or conclude that someone is not building to code? I mean, is it literally a cup measurement that they have in their regs, or is it a standard that they're using?
Well, cup for cup is a term, but you can take it that literally.
Okay.
Whether it's a cup or a teaspoon.
Right. That's what I was wondering. How do they judge whether or not it's appropriately functioning? I guess.
Okay, it's a great question. That typically falls on the shoulders of the civil engineer that is presenting to you an application for permit. Part of that application would need to include their justification for both what floodplain impacts they are proposing and how they are proposing to put it back. And you can't just put it anywhere. If your floodplain's on the front of your property and you're building it up, isolating it from that floodplain, you can't just dig a little hole in the back of your property. It has to be connected. Otherwise, it doesn't do you any good.
If I could just ask a question.
Certainly.
Let me make sure this is on. There we go. The property that you're speaking of, where it goes under somebody's residence, I know that's on the other side of Colorado, because I've been over there numerous times.
Yes, ma'am.
What are the chances for that home just falling in? I mean, the water literally runs under the property, and now we're pooling it to the right there, where you spoke of where the fence is. I've always been curious how they were even allowed to build over that, but.
In my observation of that particular area,
Mhm.
it looks as though the homeowners have done what they need to do to keep their yard from falling in it to some degree. That is not a level of maintenance a municipality would provide. There are other solutions to going in, and there are options there, but it's not something a homeowner or a group of homeowners is going to fork up the dollars for, because it's significant in cost.
Thank you.
And enhance enforcement of codes that protect public drainage systems. So I mentioned before some code changes that might address having proper drainage systems in place or not impeding your existing capacities. Well, there's got to be an enforcement tool in place by which that can be dealt with after permitting. Just because somebody gets a permit, doesn't mean they're going to build exactly to the letter. I mean, they should, but there needs to be an instrument by which code enforcement can take action.
In Central Florida, you seen that each municipality is passing their own ordinances pertaining to this, or I know they all work in conjunction due to Disney and these parks, a lot of them all work together, or do they all come up and say, okay, for the greater Orlando area, we're passing these ordinances? In other words, are we gonna be lockstepping with the other communities as we all grow together, which is gonna happen over the future? Or are we just looking at our pie and, how do they do it in Central Florida, I guess is the root of the question.
Well, that's a good question, and it's not done the same way everywhere.
Okay.
It's like, the technical question, you ask 5 different people, you get 5 different answers. Well, it's kind of like that with municipalities too. Some of them have a set tax base for which they apply funding to stormwater projects, because it is ongoing maintenance, just like your other infrastructure systems, your sanitary, your water system. Stormwater is no different. And some of them put in place measures only when needed. Maybe they budget, and I don't know all the details, but perhaps they budget into their public works system the maintenance that include their other infrastructure as well as stormwater, and they apply additional fees or impact fees or what have you when necessary.
If I may, I know you've taken into consideration that Lynn Haven's comprised of older neighborhoods and newer neighborhoods, and some neighborhoods have proper stormwater buildup, and others don't. And also, we're impacted by other parts of the county around us because we're closer to the water than some other places, and the stormwater will flow through us. So I don't know whether I'm answering your question or not, but we're getting it from kind of like all sides in a way, where just by where we're located. And I know your suggestions are going to encompass all that, but the thing about it is that we're not all together, fixed in a good way in certain areas of the city, and it reflects on the homeowners that are having problems. I know us as a commission, and we want to take care of the people who have structural stuff first. I mean, that's our priority. So, go ahead and finish up there, but I know we're getting it from outside of Lynn Haven also. So,
And just to speak to that, on the second bullet item there, it's Doug talked about the LDC revisions. To give an example, when we designed the Nrcs Subdivision, the stormwater pond there, and you probably all know where that is, it's on 389. It discharged to the county right-of-way. So because it discharged to that right-of-way, and they've had a lot of problems in that area, they made us design to a 100-year storm event, which that's required in their LDR if they have any areas where there's known problems. And so that would be an example of something you could add to your code if we were reviewing the subdivision or commercial development for a developer, and we knew there were problems because of this stormwater master plan. If you had it in your policy, we could require them to design them hold more water so it doesn't flood your neighbor in a higher storm event.
You'd be talking about Lynn Haven developments, correct?
Correct.
Because how do we address the runoff that's flowing off of unincorporated Bay County through Lynn Haven to the bay. I mean, that's an issue that we've got to address because that's affecting our flow too. You know,
Well,
how do you tell the county they've got to address their issue to keep it from flowing?
Well,
through the county?
that is something I'm gonna cover in the funding portion. So I think after I cover that, that may answer your question.
Okay, because I mean, if I'm not correct, the state has you can't impede the natural flow of water, correct?
Correct.
So we can't stop their water from flowing through the city.
Correct.
So the only other option is to find a way to recoup some of the costs from the county for the water flowing through.
Correct.
Okay, our top priorities. Drum roll. Hurricane Michael debris removal. I've said it over and over again. That is the number one concern. There is some good news here, though. Efforts are already underway by Bay County to remove debris from the primary waterways, and some of those include the ones that traverse through the city of Glen Haven. The next is, and there are more efforts to come. Chris is going to talk about some of the grant programs and other funding programs that are in place right now. The next is Pine Forest Estates Subdivision. The graphic on the right, you can see the colorized, that's from the map that we received from the city of reported properties that had structural flooding. That was the largest cluster of reported structural flooding throughout the city. Thereby, it ranks number 2 on our list. We have the most properties that would benefit from a single infrastructure improvement right here in this area. We feel it is there is an existing drainage system, but it is not up to the capacity. It needs improvements, it needs more storage and conveyance capacity in order to relieve flooding in this particular area. Third is the Colorado and Mississippi Avenue drainage improvement that was mentioned earlier. There's some good news here too. The design for that was completed before Hurricane Michael hit, and the construction is already underway. So that's your number 3 priority, and the fix is already in the works. Number 4, the railroad ditch system improvements. So this is the old rail line that runs through the city. There are ditches on both, significantly sized, I might add, along both sides of that railroad line. They run right through the heart of the city and go straight to North Bay. Right now, it's not utilized in its fullest capacity. Major drainage channels are hard to come by. I mean, it's like building a new road across the city that doesn't have a road there to begin with. Well, you have the luxury of having that road there already. The ditches are already there already. Some minor improvements would allow more drainage connections to that existing ditch system to allow more water to be directed to and then through the city via this corridor out to North Bay. Because it is a single improvement that serves so much of the city, and that list of 25 recommendations that we have for infrastructure improvements, quite a number of them rely on this being done. This is the nearest outfall for some of these depressional areas. Right now, the only way water can leave them is to pool up like a swimming pool and then spill out the lowest point. So this one improvement would provide multiple locations by which some of these depressional areas could then discharge out to the bay. Improvements would include upgrades to some of the culverts at road crossings, although in large part they are significantly sized today. They probably need to be cleaned out, but that's very low cost improvement. But some of the ditches on both sides could stand to be dug out, cleaned out, mowed, vegetation removed. Again, very relatively low cost for a significant benefit citywide. That's why it ranks number 4 on our list.
Doug, those drainage ditches, they flow directly North Bay, or do they flow into the bayou over on the and we already have a sediment issue in that bayou, correct?
They do flow into the bayou. I named North Bay as the ultimate receiving water.
It's over by 8th Street, circle over there.
Right.
So
So The improvements would include some downstream clearing, dredging, excavation in order for that downstream outlet to get out to the bay and have the capacity that it needs.
And, Doug, if I may, one of the promises of the developer who purchased the fuel depot property, Marina Island LLC, was to breach that causeway that leads out across that bayou. And so, we're sort of at an impasse with that contract right now, but I would hope that in the future that should we, when that property changes hands, if it does, whatever, that maybe we could involve DEP in some way. The causeway is an outdated structure which is no longer needed. It's not World War II. We're not traversing with trucks anymore. And it seems to me that whoever the new owner of that property would be, that we should seek some kind of permitting to breach that causeway and clean out that bayou. We're losing, wildlife. The people that are in there they're looking at trash. They're having to clean that every day. It is a mess. And DEP is the most critical organization for the smallest, faux pas that we make as a city. And for them not to address this, to me, is just a travesty. They need to address that and give us permission, whoever the owner is, to tell them they've got to do that, to clean that out. So I think that would be a huge step forward in keeping that cleaner in there.
If I may?
Yes.
The other concern I have is how will the ditches along the railroad, how is that going to affect rails to trails? It won't affect it at all?
It won't.
Okay. So it's not gonna ever accumulate water?
No.
No, it'll just act as conveyance,
Okay.
drainage.
Well, I take that answer back. It was not, the intent is not for it to accumulate water, but to collect it and transport it out to the bay.
So, we wouldn't have safety issues. We're not talking great amounts of water where a child could fall in. Okay, thank you.
The design would certainly need to take that into account, yes. Next is the Bel Air Estates drainage system. This was the second largest cluster of properties with reported structural flooding, although not a tight cluster like you're seeing here at Pine Forest Estates. It's more of a shotgun pattern. That neighborhood does have an existing drainage system with pipes and inlets that drains to one of your major drainage channels. So we feel that the shotgun pattern is an indication of not widespread flooding like you have here in the graphic, but that the existing drainage system might very well just be clogged. So it's number 5 on our list because it is again a single improvement that affects a relatively large number of properties. And cleaning and video, it's a cleaning then video inspection because it might be more than just sedimentation or debris. There might be some pipes that are undersized. There could be some damage to pipes. If a joint breaks in storm pipe, then that's an avenue by which soil can then leak into it. You wouldn't necessarily know that's an issue on the surface. It could create a cavity under there that just hasn't caved in yet, but your pipes could be clogged in the process. And if it could be that poor construction was partly to blame, and that you've got broken pipe joints all throughout the neighborhood. Or it could just be one at the downstream end. There's no way of knowing that without first cleaning the system out, which you have to do before you can then video inspect it. So that's number 5 on our list because it has such a large number of homes that it would serve by doing one particular improvement. And again, at relatively low cost. So now I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Okay, I'm not sure, I'm assuming you all have read the study and specifically the recommendations. And if you total those numbers, they're 15.1 million. I know that's a large number. However, please know that there is some funding available. Nrcs, Lynn Haven was the first city to get Nrcs funding to clean all of the waterways. Somewhere around $7.5 million for that. And we expect to get an agreement from NRCS in the next 3 to 4 weeks. So that can move forward. And earlier Doug talked about cleaning out all those waterways so that can happen. And that might be able to be done before the end of the year. So, that's the first item that you see up there under the funding sources.
And Chris, can I just comment for the publics, that there are I would say 90% of the phone calls that I've received in the last couple of months, and before the storm as well, have been from those residents around Bel Air, Publix, back near Mowat Middle School, and that waterway back there is a primary objective of this, is what I wanted to let the public know, because people are so concerned about that every time it rains, there are literally 2 or 3 homes at least there that already flood, and then there are streets behind there that do. So this is a huge concern, and so I really want us to let people know, if you're at this meeting, or if you're watching it on the computer, or whatever you're doing, that this funding is for that problem, and we're hoping good things for that. So
That is correct, and Bobby and I have talked about that being the first waterway that we clean. So the second funding source there is the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which is called HMGP. It is a program that is funded by both through FEMA and through the State Department of Emergency Management. In some preliminary estimates, we think they're going to fund somewhere around $70 million at a minimum. Now that will go to all of the areas that were impacted by Hurricane Michael, but Bay County did receive a large majority of that. So there is some good opportunity to use that grant money for these projects. I'm not sure specifically how much of this would apply to the program. The FEMA Hurricane Michael reimbursement program, this is the same reimbursement that you're getting for the debris removal. So for any of the damaged inlets, pipes, or any of those that we document along with all the road repairs, that will be a reimbursement of 90% from FEMA. There's also, Commissioner Russell, you mentioned earlier about the county. If you look down in the recommendations, there are several projects that total about $1 million of this $15 million. The McCain Creek widening, the Dundee Lane crossing, which is there in Moa Highlands, the 24th Street crossing, Aberdeen Parkway, and Mosley Drive. All of those culverts are all undersized, but they do, via through McCain Creek, they carry a lot of water from the Highland Park area, which is in the county. So we plan on, as soon as this plan is adopted, going to the county and requesting that they assist with the funding of these improvements. So we wouldn't recommend doing any of those until we get the county on board for funding, maybe more than half. We'll see what we can do with them. The next one is the Bay County Recovery Task Force. Commissioner Russell is on that task force as a representative from the city of Lynn Haven. And we did provide the county the $15 million number to plug into their task force master plan. There may be some funding out of that, I don't know, but maybe there's also some cost share out of that. And then lastly, earlier on, Doug also mentioned that the stormwater in the city is underfunded. I mean, you constantly have to take money from the general fund and other enterprise funds to fund your stormwater improvements. So as we finish this master plan and you adopt it, it's a good time for us to go, or we think there's a good time for us to go to the rate consultants that also handle your water and your sewer rates, and have them look at the current user and impact fees and see how those need to be adjusted based on these recommendations. So we kind of think that's the next step. We can let them come to us and recommend how they think you should handle some of the newer subdivisions versus the older subdivisions, and they can kind of give you recommendations on how to structure your rates from both the user side of things and both for new development. So that kind of covers all the funding sources that are available. So that ends our presentation, and we'll open it up to any more questions that you might have.
Mine is really not a question, it's a statement, and it's nothing new. Everybody who knows me has heard me say this from the day I became mayor. I have never been happy with the way that our public works department pushing any, blame on any one person, any one circumstance, but every city manager that has been with me, and even before I ran for mayor, the previous city manager, I complained to him as well, that there's never, I still, to this day, I never see crews out in Lynn Haven cleaning the ditches, I mean, until after the storm. As far as like normal maintenance, I don't see that going on. And there is no plan. I've asked to see street by street plans, I've asked to see neighborhood by neighborhood plans, and we can't seem to get that done. And I've heard the excuses, we don't have the equipment, we don't have enough people, we don't have people who are willing to do the work, we can't keep those people. We've explored using community service from the sheriff's office, and the answer there is, well, we can't always get those workers here. So this is a problem that this commission, I hope, will take on seriously, that we have, we charge our public works department, our public works director, find out what they need that they can get this done. Is it more people? Is it more equipment? Is it someone who has a different vision that can help us get a schedule going? But Chris, you told me yourself, I think in an earlier meeting, that 50% of the issues of stormwater in this city could be solved if we just did ditch maintenance. 50%, that's half of this. And so it seems to me, and you said it a minute ago yourself, Doug, if we could get this cleaned up, we could move forward. So I think that as we look at next year's budget, as we move forward after the storm, there's a lot of debris that came from the storm. But I will tell you, there were a lot of ditches around here that needed maintaining way before Hurricane Michael. And I have said it over and over and over, and it fell on deaf ears with two past city managers and a city manager before them. And I do hope that we can get that done, because I just see no excuse for not doing it. So I didn't mean that to sound so negative. I just feel passionately about it. I'm sorry.
Any questions?
Keep that figure in mind, that 50% of this problem can be solved by maintenance, the easiest thing.
I have a question about rate study. When we do that, when we suggest have a party go out and like we put in for all of this to be done, rate study, just they'll come back and say over how much time we'll have to raise rates. Is that what it is?
Yes, what they would do is take this dollar figure and put it into their models that they have, the financial models, and look at it at a 5, 10, 15-year period and see what that looks like with all of your current users. Similar to the way they do with your water and your wastewater.
And we have a huge disparity. I mean, it doesn't, like some people's stormwater and stuff is sufficient and runs well, but across the board we'll end up paying more, right?
Correct. So if you bought a home in Shoreline Village behind North Bay Haven, they have their own stormwater facility that the HOA pays for. So there's some, when you compare that to maybe an older part of town that doesn't have a stormwater system, there's some differences there. So they will tell us how what the statutes say as to how you can break that out and what that looks like at the end of the day.
Okay. So certain people in certain parts of the town would know that it would bear the brunt of.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure how they do that.
Okay.
There are numerous factors to consider, though.
Yeah.
Just so everybody knows, I guess I'll put this out there. I'm so uncomfortable talking about money issues right now, just due to the fact that every number we have is moving and fluctuating. It's almost like saying, let's go for runs to fix our health, but our blood pressure is going nuts every day. You know what I'm saying? It's like, yeah, I know I need to take a run, but we got to figure this part out first. And I agree with the mayor. I think it's a major infrastructure issue that's been kicked down the road for a long time, and we probably need to address this and get it fixed as best we can while we have people willing to do it. But again, the money fluctuating, it scares me a little bit to make decisions right now until the dust settles a little bit. That's just me. So.
Brandon, if I could just, Commissioner Aldridge, would be familiar there with Brandon. I'm not really talking so much about construction or infrastructure as I was talking about maintenance, just cleaning, just mowing the grass, just looking in the culverts and reaching in and pulling out a mattress that's stuck inside there, that kind of thing. That's something that's doable.
Who has the authority to get that moving?
May I'll go ahead and direct to the audience, if the commission will indulge, they may have questions as well. The ultimate authority to get that moving is the city manager, and in the past, the city managers that I have dealt with have been unwilling, unable, afraid, I'm not sure what, to address the problem by going to the department heads and asking them why it's not getting done. And I don't mean that to sound terrible, that's how it is.
And what mechanisms exist to remedy that? If you have recalcitrant or whatever, people are underemployed.
Under our form of government, the city manager is the sole person who can direct employees, and so I would encourage this commission that whoever becomes the next city commission, make sure they have a real nice backbone.
I agree.
The next city manager needs to have a real good backbone and be willing to stand up and get some things done.
I appreciate you being here
Thank you, sir.
and what you're doing. That's great.
Did you guys come up with any scenarios in which we could just funnel our problem to the county? Pipes, tubes, you know?
I do have one piece of good news about that. Is that you're downstream. Like I mentioned before, these drainage way issues, you need to solve them from the downstream end and work your way upstream. So that
They'll be motivated to help us to solve their own problems, basically.
would certainly help convince them of that.
Just again, we're looking at a 15.1 million price tag today, what you say on the projects, right?
Correct.
Best case scenario with funding and stuff, do you have a figure or what you think, like this is $15.1 million without any additional funding?
Without any
without any
assistance.
additional assistance that you just portrayed in your 5 points, right?
Correct.
Do you think, there's a best case on what you can get on all 5 of these, or
I can tell you, I think we'll get some grant dollars, but not how much.
not how much?
Well, we know those major waterways are going to be clean. That's $7 million right there. So that's.
Well, that's not part of the 15.1.
But it's going to help us to mitigate until we get to that
It will,
point, is my
correct,
point.
Correct.
Mayor,
Yes.
I just wanted to say, I agree with Commissioner Aldridge in the sense that just 2 weeks ago, we are in the realization that the city is $70 million in debt. I find it also very hard to say, yeah, let's just go ahead and tack on, make it 85 million right now, when I think if common sense tells me, but maybe I'm wrong, so correct me if I am, if we concentrate on clearing the ditches and doing the maintenance, it's gotta help for a little while, at least until we can see our Fema reimbursement, insurance, even though that has nothing to do with this, the insurance, to see what kind of funds we have to work with. But do we have any idea on the length of time at all that we'll see our Fema reimbursements?
We anticipate that 4.9 to be in probably within the next week. It's been about 2.5 weeks. That's 4.9 that we know that we'll be getting. Of course, the 8.1, that will be another shot in the arm from FEMA, but that will go through the regular process. So we're looking at 4 to 6 months down the road. I will say one of the reasons that we put this workshop on today is for you to get a feel of, the coming months, what's going to be taking place and how we're going to have to budget for that. This is a budgetary issue, and so I wanted you to be aware of when we start to bring our budget to you and we start to put in some of these costs, that you understand why this is so important. We do anticipate that the city of Lynn Haven will look really good in the next couple of months when we get through with our insurance, FEMA. We have a community disaster loan that's coming through, some other sources that Chris has already talked to us about. We'll be in good shape in order to handle some of these costs, But some of these costs will just be, us putting in, putting in some new employees, putting in new equipment to make sure some of these things can get done. And that's really the bottom line of it. So when we start to work on a budget and you see some new items, you see some new personnel, you'll understand why those people are in place.
Anyone else from the commission have anything you'd like to say, or questions you'd like to ask before we move into the regular meeting? We're running a little bit over, and then I'll ask for if there's any public.
If I may, I'd just like to ask one more thing. It's 15.1 million for every project listed, right?
Correct.
All right, do you have a figure for the top 5 that you showed us? Just that top 5?
About 4 million,
About 4 million for the top 5 projects that would,
yes.
okay.
And I do apologize, we have almost an hour left. My watch was set to Eastern time. I've been traveling, so we do have plenty of time for comments and questions.
So, sir?
You had mentioned, or I had read in the paper or heard that Minhaven wants to beautify things. It seems to me that this project is more critical than trying to spend money on beautifying things. Even though that's important and that would be nice, but the nice to have things should come later after the things that really need to be done.
Sure, and anyone else can comment as well, but I would concur with you that this is crucial. It has been crucial for many years. It didn't just happen right now, but it's worsened by the storm. But I would also let you know that some of the things that you'll see occasionally that will happen, example, someone had made a comment to me about the splash pad, that we were working to get the splash pad redone. The money for that came out of a different pot of money that could not be used for anything else. And so the same thing with the beautification. If the Florida Department of Transportation gave us a grant to put the beautification there. So when you hear those kinds of things, sometimes just look at where the funding's coming from. Sometimes we're limited. You have this money, but you have to spend it for this. So we're not taking money from Stormwater to do things that would not be as beneficial. So. Mr. Walker?
3 things. I'd like clarification on your term, the railroad ditch. I'm a little confused. The term, the fuel depot came up. The original railroad ditch ran the railroad from the Port Park down through Panama City, and that's been covered over. Is that the ditch that you're talking about, or are you talking about the rails to trails?
It is the rails to trails rail bed.
And the main ditch is covered over.
It's shallow in some areas, but for the majority of the length, there is a still in use, still functioning ditch system.
And also, thank you. There's 2 storms that you mentioned, which were pretty close back to back. They did more damage in stormwater than Michael did. Michael, from my observation where I stood, did not have a good water problem where I was. For example, those 2 storms, which were the storms of the century by the city manager, he labeled them this 100-year storm. We had it 1 week, he labeled it, and then the next week we had the same one. 2. Those closed 77 had water come up 200 yards into the residential area from 77. That is what you should be looking at. Michael is what the mayor is pointing out. Debris filling up the ditches and that was of concern. That to me is where the water problem is, besides being 6 inches below the surface of the earth in Minhaven. I think that's more of a concern than what we're going to get out of the next storm, which Gulf Power is saying is going to come.
The 100-year storm event is what we modeled. In fact, we modeled several durations of 100-year return storm events. 100-year critical storm events are typically what you model for lack of a better term, a worst case scenario.
Okay.
That is, I hear routinely, a 100-year storm is equivalent to your average Category 3 hurricane. Now, There's some clarification there because the category of hurricane has to do with wind speed. It has nothing to do with how much rainfall it drops. These storm events, I would not doubt at all, sir, that Hurricane Michael did not drop as much water in Lynn Haven as they did. And it doesn't take a far distance for the amount of rainfall depth to change. Early in the presentation, one of my graphics was a slide that showed the depth of rainfall across the southeastern United States. And in the Lynn Haven area, it was 7 to 8 inches roughly. I live in Southport and I got over 12 inches, so it doesn't take very far, and I got 50%, or you got 50% of the rainfall that I did just about, with only 4 miles away. So you have to look at it as kind of a randomized event. It's called a 100-year event, but that doesn't mean you're going to get it about once every 100 years. It's like rolling a dice. You have the same odds of getting a number when you roll a dice as the first time, as the second time. The odds don't change, but it is a statistical analysis that says that is your likelihood of getting this type of storm in this kind of frequency, but it bears no significance to what really happens. It's just a bar that is set for engineers and others to utilize in order to protect drainage systems and plan for emergency management. You got to set the bar somewhere.
My last and short comment is this. You look at the UDLC and what we've changed the rules. For example, in my area, in the old area, the old houses built 1911, 1920, et cetera, were built on such a level. The new UDLC is giving us, they have to raise property in new development. They've subdivided the plots and made more density into the area, therefore causing stormwater runoff to your neighbors. That has not been taken into consideration. For example, the plots were labeled out at 45% permeable ground, but they're building houses bigger than the 50% to cover. So this is causing us a trouble. I'm glad you're going to look at that, and I hope you look at that. We're also paying the developers to do this. So it's a double-edged sword we've got. Take a look at that UDLC and our regulations that are causing the newer houses to be elevated, causing the stormwater to run off to the older ones. I'm glad you're looking into that.
Those are exactly the sort of things that I'm inferring when I mention changes to code.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for coming.
Are there other comments from the commission or the public? Yes, ma'am.
Thanks. So my name's Debbie Anderson. I live at 901 Colorado Avenue. My house incurred 8 inches of standing water from stormwater. So having stayed in the house during the storm, I can tell you that it's maybe not the amount of rain, it is exactly how much faster it's coming down that the systems just could not absorb it. Plus we had a tremendously damp summer. So it was just, it was just the perfect storm for that situation. But I'm curious about, because I've seen them already, so they're right across my street, put those big stormwater pipes. What's the next step? How soon do you expect that? And this is something maybe we can do away from the workshop. I would just ask you guys, on a one-on-one level. But I'm just curious, what are the plans there? I'm not familiar.
And we have time to address it, so we might as well just talk.
Thank you.
So the plans have been complete, they've ordered the pipe, they told us that they're ready to start. I think it's just any day,
Okay.
as soon as they show up and start digging. I know they did go out and do some stakeout, took some shots, looking at things, so I anticipated any day.
Okay. And so, living on that one corner where I do, I have 150 feet of ditch on the right, 75 feet down the front, so I've got a lot of ditch and everything like that. So I'm just curious, what other plans is, obviously to go under the road into their stormwater pipes at that point, or?
It is, it's basically gonna take, the drainage basin from the north, and divert it, to the west and bring it around on the north side on Mississippi. So
Okay.
basically we'll take, a good majority of that stormwater that's coming from the north and divert it over,
Okay.
so that it doesn't have to come down that ditch and under the culvert and cross over Colorado.
Right.
So, it'll,
It's gonna be interesting to see what kind of stuff. Looking forward to it. That's what I can think.
If I could say something to that, I know, Mr. Baker and I spoke about that. Have they started at all down there in that area?
Well, like you said, they've got the pipe there, they've done the stakeout, and they should be starting any day. They
Okay.
did cut that wall out on 8th Street to lower the water level,
Okay,
so they did do that.
okay. And who's doing that project?
Phoenix.
Okay, and is that the, last time you and I spoke, and that's been a couple of weeks ago, they were gonna get started when they finished Porter Park, is that correct still? Or is that
Yeah, but
different?
I think they ended up working some on Highway 390.
Okay,
It's staked out and the pipe's there waiting on them.
okay. So maybe, acting city manager, we need to contact them or something. Well, I feel bad for you because I've been going out to the area for, it feels like months now. And it's always, it's gonna happen. And I think we need to hold somebody's feet to the ground, make things happen. Cause, you know, they keep saying it'll be next week. And, I've been over in that area. It's bad. Bad. Thank you.
Mayor, just a couple other things just to put out on the table in the next couple of months. Again, right before budget, we would like to present a couple of workshops if possible. I know one of the ones that we talked about was the water workshop, the utilities workshop, the rate study that you had directed, I think it was last year, when we had Stantec to come through, and they're working on that utilities rate study, and then now we're and also the sanitation rate study as well. And then now we are focused on the stormwater rate study. I think we have our first meeting this week, and be able to give you some kind of information from that initial meeting, and then some rate study feedback of what we think the city, where we think the city needs to go in order to fund some of these things. Because there will be some fees involved if we decide to go with any of the recommendations from Stantec for this rate study.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions from the commission? Yes, please, go ahead, sir.
Just a question, maybe any other comment. I live in Bel Air Estates, so I had a few inches of water in my house during the hurricane. We were gone, but I came back after 2 weeks to mold up the wall, so that was unpleasant. We dodged the bullet this last week because of the amount of rain that was projected for Saturday. Friday over the weekend didn't happen. And so the ditch was right behind my house is pretty full on Thursday. And Saturday it rains, and my son says, my youngest, who says, it's raining, what do I do? So in all this conversation about time or about money and budget, it's time. We have less trees sucking up water. The flooding problem that was there is going to get worse, and it's wet. It's going to be wet. It's summer. It's going to rain. We don't know how much rain. Time's a big deal. On those 5 priorities, are all of those sitting there? I know Colorado's underway, which just seems like that's running. So of the others, the Bel Air thing, is that on hold until we figure out money? Is that what I'm hearing? Is that kind of, or is there stuff moving along with that?
No, it is moving. The funding that we were just speaking of, the $7.2 million, that is for those, specifically for those waterways behind Bel Air, and that's anticipated within the next 2 to 3 weeks, which when you're living in a house with water headed to your back door is a measurably long period of time. But that is what's coming, and I have asked, you know, if there's any mitigation that we can do as the city, if we have any equipment, any people available that can get out there and clean anything, help with anything, I've asked for that over and over. I'm pretty much told that we don't have the equipment to do it until this funding comes through. So there's nothing that I can say of comfort to you except 2 to 3 weeks, and I feel terrible about that.
I know the RFP that's out there that I saw for that work, bids are due June 24th. What's the timeline after bids are gotten before the commission decides to pull the trigger on that?
We can call an emergency meeting if we need to get it done.
Absolutely.
How many bids have we gotten so far?
We won't know there until it's
So
near.
they're closed until, got it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Mhm.
And emergency meeting was the wrong term. We can call a special meeting would be the word to use. Are there other questions? Anyone else from the commission? I would like to thank Panhandle Engineering for your work on this. It's been a long time coming, and it almost feels terrible to have the plan in your hand, but don't have the ability to push it forward. But thank you very much for the work that you've done on it, and we'll look forward to the time that we have the funding, to go forward with it. And, but having a plan is better than not having one. And, so thank you for all the work that you've done.
Thank you.
Anyone else from the public have anything at all about this? It's 20 after 3, so our regularly scheduled commission meeting will start at 4 o'clock, and you're welcome to stay or hang out with us or come back or whichever. Meeting is adjourned.